If you agree that respect should never depend on the title on your chest or the broom in your hands, like and subscribe. Because this story proves that the quietest figure in the room might carry the heaviest legacy. She wasn't a soldier, not anymore. She was just the woman sweeping sand off the barracks steps while the wind blew harder than the laughter tossed her way. That's what they all thought. A cleaner, a nobody, a young woman who looked out of place among steel, uniforms, and flags. She didn't argue, didn't correct them, didn't try to explain. She simply pushed her broom back and forth across the stone, her eyes following lines in the sand no one else noticed, her shoulders steady under the weight of silence. Until the morning a SEAL captain stepped out of a black SUV, paused at the courtyard, and saluted her first. And when his voice cut the air, Quarry echo, mission lead, the entire base froze. No one laughed again. The story begins at dawn on a coastal naval installation where the salt air carried grains of sand across concrete, where gulls circled like restless sentries, and where a young woman named Mariah Vega, late 20s, went about her daily work as though the world had decided she existed for nothing more than a mop bucket and a broom. She rose before the recruits, arrived before the drills began, her hair tied back beneath a faded cap, her uniform a simple facilities coverall that marked her as maintenance staff, not military. To the men and women training for battle, she was background, part of the landscape, just another figure blending into the gray routine of base life. They called her Mop Girl, Dust Duty, sometimes Sand Sweep, nicknames muttered with smirks and rolled eyes, nicknames sharp enough to wound, but never sharp enough to cut her steady silence. She never fired back. She never raised her voice. She just kept sweeping, measured strokes across the stone steps of the barracks, humming to herself, her gaze never drifting from the ground. She tended like ritual. But anyone watching closely would have seen it. Her movements weren't lazy or casual. They were deliberate, patterned, almost tactical. The way she checked corners before leaning her broom against the railing. The way she paused to scan the perimeter when gulls broke formation overhead. The way her eyes lingered a second too long on the patrol routes and camera posts no one else cared about. She didn't look like someone trying to scrub dirt. She looked like someone waiting, preparing, calculating in silence. Yet no one asked why. No one thought to. In their minds, she was too young to be wise, too ordinary to be remarkable, too invisible to matter. One lieutenant in particular, sharp uniform pressed to perfection, shine boots reflecting morning sun, made a sport of her presence. He called out across the yard. "Careful, don't let the broom outrank you, Vega." His friends laughed, recruits joined in, and for a brief moment the entire yard seemed to pulse with cruel amusement. Mariah didn't flinch. She didn't even look up. She swept another line through the sand as if the words had never reached her ears. But the youngest recruit on base, eyes wide and uncertain with the weight of his first assignment, noticed the smallest detail. That she angled the broom handle like a rifle held at rest, her stance balanced, her shoulders squared in a way no janitor would think to stand. He noticed too how she didn't break rhythm, didn't stumble under ridicule, but kept her pace steady as though the laughter itself was just another gust of wind across her steps. The wind carried more than sand that morning. It carried whispers. Recruits speculated she was related to someone high up, that she had been hired out of pity, that maybe she lingered here because she had nowhere else to go. They treated her presence like a joke, a curiosity, a living reminder that not everyone on base was built for glory. But beneath their smirks and jokes was something deeper, something they couldn't put words to, unease. Because when Mariah Vega looked up, her eyes weren't the eyes of a cleaner. They were the eyes of someone who had already seen too much, who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They were the eyes of someone who had been measured by fire before and walked away steady. By noon, when the sun was high and drills were underway, she sat quietly on the steps, broom at her side, sipping from a battered thermos of coffee. Alone as always. The recruits stormed past in formation, boots pounding pavement, chants filling the air. They didn't notice her. They never did. Yet she noticed everything. The cadence of their steps, the uneven line where one soldier was slightly off, the delay in the command echo that should have been sharper. She didn't write it down. She didn't report it. She simply saw it, logged it somewhere no one else had access to. Every day was the same rhythm. Sweep. Pause. Watch. Sweep again. And every day the mockery sharpened, because nothing unsettles arrogance more than a silence it can't break. They tried sarcasm. They tried jokes. They tried pity. None of it earned a reaction. To them, she was harmless. To them, she was forgettable. To them, she was just a young woman cleaning sand off stone. But she knew what they didn't. She knew what sand could hide, what wind could cover, what the untrained eye could miss. She knew that sometimes the most important steps aren't taken in front of cheering crowds, but in the quiet corners where no one is looking. And so the stage was set. A woman in her late 20s, dismissed as invisible, swept her broom across the barracks steps each morning under a sky that had no idea it was about to crack open. Because soon, the laughter would stop. Soon, the silence would be broken. And soon, the name Mariah Vega would no longer be whispered as a joke, but remembered as a code word spoken in reverence. Quarry Echo, mission lead. The storm didn't begin with thunder or lightning, not with the kind of violence that rattles windows or shakes foundations, but with something quieter, subtler, and far more unnerving. A glitch, barely a tremor in the base's systems, a hiccup in the alarm grid during what should have been a routine storm readiness drill. Just another test for recruits to practice discipline under simulated pressure. Yet when the sirens faltered mid-cycle, their echoes died in the courtyard, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like the ocean itself had paused to listen. And in that gap the illusion of order collapsed. Recruits stumbled in half-drilled chaos, their chants unraveling into jagged shouts, boots losing cadence against the wet concrete, and radios spat nothing but static as the young lieutenant with the polished boots and louder mouth than sense barked orders that tangled together like fishing lines dragged under the tide. Contradictory, panicked, hollow, his voice cracking with frustration while the courtyard turned into a storm of bodies moving nowhere, drills scattering into confusion, every second wasted, every motion proving that practice meant nothing without control. And then, against the backdrop of that unraveling, there was a sound softer than panic, yet sharper than authority. The hollow clatter of wood against stone as a broom slid from calloused fingers and fell onto the wet steps of the barracks. Mariah Vega moved. Not slowly, not cautiously, but with the speed of someone whose body remembered what it was like to have seconds decide lives. Her boots cutting across the courtyard while others froze or stumbled. Her hair tucked under her faded cap whipping loose in the storm breeze. Her face steady where officers flailed. And when she reached the auxiliary command console tucked beside the armory wall, she didn't hesitate. Her fingers danced across the keypad with precision, striking sequences of numbers and letters no one had posted on the drill charts. Codes not meant for janitors, not even meant for lieutenants. Codes buried so deep in clearance levels that only mission specialists should have known them. And yet she entered them without pause, muscle memory guiding her like an old song replayed in her veins. And in less than a heartbeat the alarms roared back to life, calibrated, synchronized, sharper than before. Red lights flared across the yard. The radar pinged clean again, comms cleared. From static to sharp clipped status reports. And the recruits, confused, disoriented, snapped back into formation as though order itself had returned through her hands, though none of them could understand how. For a moment, the courtyard froze, not in panic but in stunned disbelief. Dozens of eyes snapping toward the woman they had spent months mocking, the one they called Mop Girl and Dust Duty, standing with her hand still on the console, her chest rising steady, her brow damp not from fear but from the coastal humidity, and she didn't say a word, didn't seek recognition, didn't glance for approval. She simply pressed one final key to lock the override, then walked back toward the steps, picked up her broom from where it had fallen, brushed the sand from its handle, and resumed sweeping as though nothing had happened, as though she hadn't just restored order in 60 seconds where trained officers had failed. But silence doesn't stay silent long. Whispers began before the drill even ended, traveling in half-muttered disbelief from recruit to recruit, officer to officer, growing legs and running faster than formation drills ever could. How did she know the override? Who taught her? Why did she move like that? A few suggested luck, a few suggested sabotage, but none could ignore the truth they had witnessed, that in the very moment when the base fractured, she had stood steady, unflinching, and the broom girl had outclassed them all. By nightfall, The whispers had become stories, exaggerated but not invented. Some claimed she had broken into restricted codes. Others swore they saw her smile like someone reliving an old mission. But the truth lay heavier than any rumor. They all knew they had seen competence far beyond janitorial work. The lieutenant who had once barked jokes about her wasting her youth on broom handles snapped at anyone who mentioned it, his bravado cracking at the edges, yet his silence only fanned the flames. The commander tried to downplay it, calling it a lucky guess during an officers' meeting. But the younger recruits weren't fooled. They had washed their hands on the console. They had heard the clarity of systems rebooting in perfect sync. They had seen her calm while others panicked, and you can't unsee that kind of steadiness. By the time the base lights dimmed and night shadows stretched long across the barracks, something heavier than rumor had settled over the compound, a weight of unspoken recognition that none of them wanted to name but all of them felt, and it lingered in the air when headlights cut across the front gates, twin beams slicing through mist as a black SUV rolled to a halt in the courtyard, its windows tinted, its presence unannounced but undeniable. The engine stilled, the door opened, and out stepped a figure that turned heads even before his uniform caught the light. Captain Elias Brandt, United States Navy SEALs, his frame upright, his walk measured, every line of his dress sharp enough to slice through the coastal wind, and the medals on his chest gleamed faint under the yard lamps like reminders that he was a man whose reputation didn't need words. Instantly, officers straightened, recruits stiffened, salutes snapped into the air like panicked apologies, but Brandt didn't acknowledge them, not with a nod, not with a glance. He didn't slow when the base commander rushed forward, offering a rapid-fire report about the glitch, the drill, the supposed janitor's interference, words tumbling out like excuses dressed as explanations. Brandt walked past him. He didn't break stride when the lieutenant puffed his chest and barked something about discipline being restored. He didn't stop at the command post or the radar screen. His boots echoed steady across the courtyard, his eyes locked in one direction, unyielding, until the only sound in the courtyard was that rhythm of leather against stone, measured, inevitable, cutting through the silence like judgment. And then he stopped, not before the commander, not before the lieutenant, not even before the gathered formation that had paused drills to watch. He stopped at the base of the barracks steps, where Mariah Vegas stood with her broom angled against the railing, her thermos balanced on the top step, her posture calm, her face unreadable, her eyes meeting his without surprise, as though she had known this moment would come, as though she had been waiting. For a heartbeat, the world held still, recruits frozen mid-breath, officers rigid with confusion, even the gulls circling overhead stilled in the wind. And then the silence shattered, not with panic this time, not with laughter, but with the unmistakable crack of discipline as Captain Elias Brandt lifted his hand to his brow and saluted, sharp, unwavering, deliberate. The words that followed were low but carried farther than sirens. Quarry Echo, mission lead. The courtyard stopped breathing. The commander blinked, speechless. The lieutenant paled, his lips parting but no sound escaping. The recruits stared, their young faces struggling to reconcile the woman with the broom and the name that had just been spoken like scripture. Because Quarry Echo wasn't a janitorial code. It wasn't a facilities designation. It was a mission call sign, one whispered in fragments through special ops training. A ghost story of an operation buried so deep under classification that only fragments survived in rumor. A mission that had saved lives against impossible odds. A mission spoken of in shadows with respect too heavy to mock. And now that name had been given to the woman sweeping sand from their steps. Mariah didn't return the salute at first. She held Brandt's gaze, her hand resting steady on the broom handle, her silence heavier than the weight of the courtyard. And then she whispered, soft enough to sting but loud enough to be heard. I told them to burn that call sign. And with those words, everything the base thought it knew about her cracked apart, because the janitor they had mocked wasn't invisible, wasn't ordinary, wasn't forgettable. She was Quarry Echo. She had been mission lead. And every recruit, every officer, every man and woman standing in that courtyard knew, in a single breath, that the sand she swept from the steps had never been about cleaning. It had been about watching, waiting, and remembering the perimeter. And now, finally, they understood why. The silence after those words was heavier than the storm itself, the courtyard frozen in a stillness no drill could manufacture. Every recruit, every officer, every passing mechanic or cook suddenly realizing they were standing in the middle of a revelation that cracked through rank, shattered pretense, and rewrote the ground beneath their boots. Because Quarry Echo, mission lead, wasn't just a code. It was history, a name buried so deep under classification that most thought it belonged to rumor. And now it stood there in flesh and bone, broom in one hand, coffee thermos in the other, a young woman barely into her late 20s carrying a weight of respect older than anyone in that yard had earned. The commander stammered something about misidentification, his voice faltering as Captain Brandt's salute lingered in the air like judgment. And then the truth poured out in sharp, clipped sentences that silenced him. Brandt explained to the gathered ranks that Mariah Vega had not been support, not an observer, not a tag-along, but the architect of Quarry Echo, the mission lead who had coordinated a covert counterinsurgency extraction that saved over 40 lives without a single casualty, a mission where silence was the weapon and patience the shield, a mission so critical its records were sealed and its participants sworn into anonymity. Except some truths could not be erased, and Brandt, with his salute, had just placed that truth back into the world. The recruits looked at each other in shock, the young ones realizing the woman they mocked had once commanded SEAL teams with nothing but calm and certainty, and the lieutenant, so loud in derision, so proud in ignorance, stood pale, his mouth working soundlessly as if trying to swallow his own arrogance, because in one instant his strikes meant less than her silence. What followed wasn't ceremony, at least not at first. It was reckoning, raw and unavoidable, whispered first through the barracks halls that night, then echoing louder the next morning in the mess line when recruits bowed their heads awkwardly in greeting, when officers who had ignored her shifted uncomfortably in her presence, when the broom she carried seemed less a tool of cleaning than a staff of judgment. But Mariah did not bask in it, did not demand their apologies, did not lecture. She swept the steps as always, calm, steady, refusing the spotlight, until Brandt called a formal gathering 3 days later in the main hall, filling every seat with recruits, officers, staff, everyone who had once looked past her, and the commander stood stiff at the podium, but yielded it without protest when Brandt took the microphone and spoke her name into the silence. Mariah Vega, Quarry Echo, mission lead. The room hushed so tight you could hear breath hitching in throats. And then Mariah walked in, not in dress whites, not in decorated blues, but in the same facility's uniform she always wore, broom left leaning against the hall entrance, her thermos absent, her hands empty, her face calm. She didn't stand behind the podium, didn't seek its height, but spoke from the floor, her voice steady, carrying without force. Leadership isn't about who shouts the loudest. It isn't about medals or ranks stitched on your chest. It's about who watches, who prepares, and who acts when everyone else is looking the other way. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the room of faces flushed with shame and awe. I swept steps because I was told to sweep steps. But while I swept, I watched. And when the storm came, I remembered what mattered. Not the broom, not the mockery, not even the stripes. The perimeter. Always the perimeter. She said no more. She turned and walked out, and the silence she left behind was louder than any applause could have been. Yet her words dug deep, and within hours, recruits were whispering perimeter to each other like prayer. Officers were digging through training manuals with new eyes, and by week's end, the commander himself ordered her record partially unsealed, enough that a framed photo of Quarry Echo's mission brief, her name circled in red, was hung in the Hall of Valor, though Mariah never went to see it. Instead, she kept to her steps, sweeping sand with the same patience as before, until one morning the broom was gone, the steps bare, and in its place taped neatly to the railing was a folded note in handwriting crisp and sharp. Mission never ends. Watch your perimeter. She left no forwarding address, no farewell, just those words and the silence of someone who had already moved on to where she was needed next. They called the steps Echo Steps after that. Not officially at first, but in whispers that grew into habit until even the base commander used the phrase in inspection reports, and new recruits arriving for training were told the story not in classrooms, but by being marched at dawn to those very steps, ordered to stand still as the wind swept sand around their boots, told to remember that once a young woman with a broom taught the base more about leadership than any manual ever had in years. Later, when storms rattled the coast again and alarms flickered with the same old glitches, they remembered her hands on the console, her silence under ridicule, her eyes scanning what no one else saw. And in those moments, they understood the truth Mariah Vega had lived every day she swept sand. That respect is not given by command. It is revealed by presence. And sometimes the ones you overlook are the ones who hold the line when it matters most.